disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
What if the creature hunting vampires was more terrifying to them than the vampires themselves? That is the central idea behind Blade, the 1998 superhero horror film that brought one of Marvel's darker characters to the big screen and helped establish a very different kind of comic book movie. Released in August 1998, the film stars Wesley Snipes as Blade, a half-human, half-vampire warrior who has spent his life turning his supernatural abilities against the creatures responsible for his existence. But this isn't a conventional superhero origin story. There is no brightly colored costume, no ordinary secret identity, and no comfortable separation between good and evil. Blade lives in a world where vampires operate beneath modern society, controlling their own underground networks while humans remain largely unaware of the war taking place around them. Blade knows exactly what they are, and he has made it his mission to destroy them. Blade is caught between two worlds. He possesses many of the strengths associated with vampires, including enhanced physical abilities, but he doesn't share their desire to prey upon humans. His dependence on a special serum helps him suppress the bloodlust that comes with his condition. That makes Blade an unusual protagonist. He isn't trying to become human again. He isn't searching for acceptance. His objective is much simpler. Find vampires. Kill them. Then find more. His most important ally is Abraham Whistler, an experienced vampire hunter who has essentially become Blade's mentor and surrogate father. Whistler understands the vampire world and has devoted his life to fighting it. Together, they operate from the shadows, preparing weapons, researching their enemies and moving from one hunt to the next. But their routine changes when a young hematologist named Karen Jensen becomes involved. Karen doesn't begin the story as a vampire hunter. She's a medical professional whose understanding of blood makes her valuable to both sides of the conflict. After an encounter with a vampire leaves her infected, Blade and Whistler are forced to make a decision. They can abandon her to the infection, or bring her into their world and attempt to find a way to save her. Karen's survival gradually exposes her to a reality she never knew existed. The people around her aren't necessarily who they appear to be. Hospitals aren't always safe. The police can't necessarily be trusted. And the monsters from folklore aren't folklore at all. They're real. They're organized. And they're preparing for something much bigger. While Blade hunts individual vampires, another figure is beginning to attract attention within their society. Deacon Frost, played by Stephen Dorff, isn't interested in maintaining the old order. The vampire leadership is ancient, conservative, and obsessed with tradition. Frost represents something completely different: ambition. He is young by vampire standards, impatient with the hierarchy and convinced that he deserves more power. Instead of accepting his position, Frost begins assembling his own following. His plan goes far beyond ordinary feeding. He wants to transform the balance between vampires and humans forever. And Blade becomes the one person standing directly in his way. The most interesting part of Blade isn't simply the question of whether Blade can defeat Frost. It's the question of what happens when someone who belongs to neither side becomes the most dangerous enemy of both. Blade isn't completely human. He isn't completely vampire. And because he doesn't fit neatly into either world, he becomes a threat to everyone who depends upon that division. That idea gives the film its identity. Blade represents the outsider who has turned his own curse into a weapon. Frost represents someone who refuses to accept the limits imposed on him. Karen represents the ordinary human being dragged into a hidden war. And Whistler represents the generation that has been fighting this battle long before anyone else knew it existed. Their paths eventually collide as Frost's plan becomes increasingly dangerous. Wesley Snipes was arguably the defining element of the movie. His blade is deliberately restrained. Rather than constantly explaining himself, the character communicates through his actions, attitude, and physical presence. The result is a protagonist who feels closer to an action hero than a traditional comic book superhero. The film surrounds him with vampire mythology, horror imagery, and supernatural violence, but Blade himself remains grounded in determination. He's not fighting because he believes the world will thank him. He's fighting because somebody has to. Blade arrived at a time when Hollywood had not yet entered the modern era of enormous interconnected superhero franchises. That makes its success particularly significant. The film demonstrated that a Marvel character could headline a darker, R-rated action movie and still attract a mainstream audience. Its mixture of martial arts, horror, science fiction elements, and comic book mythology gave it a distinctive identity. And although its visual effects and some of its production techniques now reflect the era in which it was made, the film's influence can still be seen in later comic book adaptations. Most importantly, Blade helped prove that Marvel characters outside the company's most famous heroes could carry a major motion picture. But how does someone become a vampire if they weren't born into that world? For Deacon Frost, the answer is ambition. Unlike the ancient vampires who cling to their traditions, Frost sees the vampire hierarchy as something that can be overturned. He doesn't want to serve the old leadership. He wants to replace it. That makes him more dangerous than an ordinary vampire. Frost begins eliminating the people standing between him and absolute power, while building a network of human collaborators who are willing to help him achieve his goal. His ultimate objective is far more disturbing than simply controlling the vampire population. He wants to summon an ancient blood deity and transform the existing order forever. Suddenly, Blade isn't just hunting vampires on the streets. He's racing against a plan that could change the entire world. One of the film's defining ideas is that vampires aren't isolated creatures hiding in dark alleys. They're everywhere. Some are wealthy. Some are powerful. Some have influence over ordinary institutions. And some humans are willing to work with them. That gives Blade's world a sense of scale. The enemy isn't one monster hiding in one location. It's an entire hidden society operating underneath the world everyone else knows. The movie also embraces its horror side with increasingly extreme creatures and violent encounters. Among the most memorable moments are the bizarre vampire designs, enormous physical threats, and the film's deliberately exaggerated action sequences. The violence is rarely subtle. Blade doesn't simply defeat his enemies. He tears through them. Vampires are burned, sliced apart, shot, crushed and destroyed in ways that make the supernatural conflict feel brutally physical. But beneath all the spectacle, the story eventually becomes personal. Blade discovers that his fight against the vampires is connected to his own past. The most disturbing revelation involves his mother. The woman whose death helped shape Blade's hatred of vampires has become something far worse, one of the creatures he has spent his entire life destroying. That creates one of the film's most emotionally charged confrontations. Blade isn't simply facing an enemy. He's facing a piece of his own history. The person who gave him life has become part of the world he despises. And Blade has to decide whether his mission is important enough to destroy even that final connection to his humanity. Behind the camera, the filmmakers wanted the vampire world to feel distinct from ordinary reality. The production uses strong color contrasts, industrial environments, practical effects, and elaborate makeup to create a world that feels simultaneously modern and ancient. The visual effects support the film rather than turning it into a purely digital spectacle. Blood, fire, prosthetics, and physical stunt work give the action a tangible quality. That approach was particularly important because the movie had to convince audiences that a relatively obscure Marvel character could carry a large-scale theatrical production. The filmmakers weren't simply adapting a comic book. They were attempting to create an entirely new cinematic identity around the character. When Blade was being developed, comic book movies were far from the guaranteed blockbusters they would eventually become. Hollywood had already produced several comic adaptations, but the results were inconsistent. Marvel itself was going through difficult financial years, making the idea of investing heavily in one of its lesser-known characters a considerable gamble. On paper, Blade was an unusual combination. A martial arts action movie. A vampire horror story. A superhero film. And a dark comic book adaptation. Those ingredients could easily have produced a mess. Instead, the filmmakers leaned into the differences. They didn't try to make Blade resemble the traditional superheroes audiences were familiar with. They made him harder, darker, and more physically grounded. Wesley Snipes was also at an important point in his career. He had already demonstrated that he could handle serious dramatic roles, but his action performances had increasingly established him as a major star of the genre. Films such as New Jack City and Demolition Man had shown audiences that Snipes could combine physical intensity with charisma. Blade offered him another opportunity. But this time, the character wasn't simply an action hero with a gun. Blade had an entire mythology behind him. He had supernatural abilities. He had a complicated relationship with his own identity. And he had a personal reason for wanting every vampire dead. Snipes' physicality became a major part of the character's appeal. The fighting style, weapons, and controlled presence made Blade feel different from other action heroes of the period. He could walk into a room filled with monsters and somehow be the most intimidating person there. The importance of Blade becomes clearer when viewed against the superhero films that followed. Before the modern Marvel era, studios were often uncertain about how seriously audiences would take comic book characters. Blade offered a different answer. You didn't have to make a comic book movie feel childish. You could make it violent. You could make it stylish. You could build an adult action story around a Marvel character without removing the elements that made the character distinctive. That gamble paid off. The movie gave audiences a Marvel hero who didn't look or behave like the conventional superheroes of the time. And it helped demonstrate that the studio could look beyond its most famous characters. The success of Blade would eventually lead to sequels and further adaptations, but its larger impact went beyond the franchise itself. It arrived before the superhero boom and helped establish a path that later comic book films could follow. For Wesley Snipes, it also provided one of his most recognizable roles. For Marvel, it proved that even a relatively unfamiliar character could become a cinematic attraction. And for audiences, it introduced a hero who operated in the space between horror and superhero cinema. Blade didn't need to fit into the existing mold. He created his own. And that may be the biggest reason the film continues to stand out decades later. Before Blade, Wesley Snipes had already thought seriously about playing another Marvel hero. Black Panther appealed to him for a very different reason. He saw the character as a noble African king and believed the story could present something Hollywood rarely offered at the time, an African civilization portrayed as powerful, sophisticated, and culturally significant. For Snipes, that wasn't simply another superhero role. It represented an opportunity to put African history, identity, and imagination at the center of a major Hollywood production. But when the Black Panther project failed to move forward, Snipes turned his attention toward Blade. He didn't just star in the movie. He also became involved as a producer, giving him a greater influence over the character and the direction of the project. And that involvement mattered. Snipes wasn't approaching Blade as just another job. He was drawing from the action performers he admired and attempting to build a character that combined physical intensity with a controlled, serious presence. The road to the finished movie wasn't straightforward. At one point, the project was connected to director David Fincher, who had already developed an early version of the film. When that version didn't happen, the studio eventually turned to another filmmaker, Stephen Norrington. Norrington was still relatively early in his career, but he had a very specific visual approach. He wasn't interested in treating Blade like a standard superhero production. He wanted to construct an entire world around the story. The vampires, locations, weapons, costumes, lighting, and action all needed to feel as though they belonged to the same universe. That approach reportedly made the production demanding. But it also helped give Blade its unusual personality. The cinematography plays an important role in creating that identity. Instead of presenting the story as a conventional urban action film, the filmmakers built a world dominated by shadows, metallic surfaces, deep colors, and harsh artificial light. The famous opening sequence immediately establishes that philosophy. Blade enters a vampire nightclub where the crowd initially appears to be enjoying an ordinary night out. Then the blood begins to fall. Within seconds, the scene transforms from a nightclub into a slaughterhouse. It's an unforgettable introduction because it tells the audience exactly what kind of movie they're watching. This isn't a superhero story where the hero politely waits for the villain to reveal himself. Blade walks into the enemy's territory and starts the fight. There was another major question surrounding the project. Would audiences actually embrace a black superhero in a serious action franchise? At the time, Hollywood had limited examples of black comic book heroes succeeding as major theatrical leads. There had been attempts, but many struggled commercially or were treated primarily as comedy. Blade approached the problem differently. It didn't make his race the punchline. It didn't apologize for the character. And it didn't build the movie around explaining why a black man could be the hero. Blade simply was the hero. His identity was part of the character, but his competence was never treated as something that required justification. That distinction became increasingly important as the film found its audience. When Blade arrived in theaters, expectations weren't necessarily enormous. But audiences responded. The movie opened strongly and reached the top of the box office, demonstrating that the combination of Marvel mythology, horror, and action could work commercially. Its performance helped convince Hollywood that comic book characters didn't necessarily have to belong to the traditional superhero formula. That lesson would become increasingly important over the following decade. Blade wasn't the biggest superhero movie ever made. But it arrived early enough to help prove that the genre had far more possibilities than Hollywood had assumed. The movie's influence can also be seen in the action films that followed. Its combination of martial arts, gunplay, supernatural horror, and stylized violence created a formula that other filmmakers would explore. The fighting wasn't treated as decoration. Blade moves like someone who has trained specifically to fight supernatural enemies. His weapons aren't simply cool accessories. They're tools designed around his mission. That attention to physical combat helped make the movie feel closer to a martial arts action film than the superhero movies audiences were accustomed to. And none of this works without Wesley Snipes. His performance is surprisingly controlled. Blade could easily have become an exaggerated character, especially surrounded by vampires, monsters, and increasingly outrageous action sequences. Instead, Snipes often plays him with restraint. He allows the world around Blade to become ridiculous while keeping the character completely serious. That contrast gives the movie much of its personality. Blade doesn't react to the supernatural world like someone seeing a monster for the first time. To him, this is just another day at work. Whether he's fighting vampires or dealing with Whistler, Snipes gives the character enough confidence to make him believable as someone who has spent his entire life preparing for this battle. Today, some aspects of Blade can feel unmistakably tied to the late 1990s. The costumes, the music, the visual effects, the industrial production design, even the exaggerated violence. But that's part of its charm. The movie isn't trying to look like today's polished superhero blockbusters. It belongs to a period when comic book adaptations were still experimenting with what they could become. And Blade chose a particularly extreme direction. It was bloody, stylish, aggressive, and unapologetically dark. The opening nightclub sequence alone feels like something a modern superhero studio would probably approach very differently. The success of Blade opened the door for sequels and strengthened Wesley Snipes' position as a major action star. The franchise continued with additional films, although the creative circumstances became increasingly complicated. Snipes' later career also encountered serious legal problems, eventually leading to a federal tax evasion conviction and imprisonment. Meanwhile, Stephen Norrington's career took him to other major productions, including The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. But Blade remained the project that defined his contribution to superhero cinema. The movie's impact on black representation in superhero cinema was significant, even though progress afterward was slower than many hoped. Blade demonstrated something Hollywood had previously been reluctant to believe. A black actor could lead a serious, commercially successful superhero movie without the character being reduced to comedy or treated as a novelty. Years later, that idea would become even more visible through the success of films centered on black superheroes and African mythology. And eventually, Marvel would return to one of the characters Snipes had once wanted to play. Black Panther would become a major global phenomenon. That makes the history even more interesting. Snipes had once seen the potential of a black superhero to represent something larger than simple entertainment. When Blade arrived, he helped prove that such a character could also become a major theatrical attraction. And that may be one of the film's most important achievements. Blade wasn't simply another vampire movie. It was evidence that the superhero genre could expand beyond the boundaries Hollywood had previously imagined. Marvel eventually brought the idea of Blade to filmmaker David S. Goyer, and he immediately understood the potential. Years later, the question of replacing Wesley Snipes would come up again. The problem was obvious. Blade isn't just a character who needs a famous actor. The role requires someone who can convincingly handle martial arts, physical action, dramatic scenes, and the character's intimidating presence. The actor also needs the physical conditioning and charisma necessary to make Blade believable. As Goyer once pointed out, there aren't many performers who can combine all of those qualities. That's part of the reason Snipes became so closely associated with the character. Even decades later, his version of Blade remains difficult to imagine replacing. When Blade was released, it exceeded expectations. At the time, Marvel had very little experience turning its characters into successful major theatrical franchises. Previous attempts had struggled badly, leaving the future of Marvel adaptations uncertain. Blade changed that conversation. It took a relatively unfamiliar character, placed him inside an R-rated supernatural action movie, and allowed the filmmakers to embrace the darker elements of the source material. That was a significant gamble. And it worked. The success demonstrated that audiences were willing to watch a Marvel character who didn't fit the traditional superhero mold. More importantly, it helped restore confidence in comic book adaptations. The impact of Blade didn't end with Blade. Its success helped create an environment in which studios became more willing to invest in other Marvel properties. Eventually, that would contribute to projects such as X-Men and Spider-Man receiving major theatrical opportunities. In that sense, Blade occupies an important position in superhero movie history. It arrived before the modern Marvel era. There was no interconnected cinematic universe. There wasn't a proven formula for turning lesser-known comic characters into worldwide franchises. And superhero films were still recovering from the damage caused by expensive failures such as Batman and Robin. Blade showed Hollywood that there was another way. One of the smartest decisions the film makes is introducing Blade through action rather than exposition. We don't begin with a long explanation of who he is. We see him working. His job just happens to involve hunting vampires. The opening sequence immediately throws the audience into his world. Blade arrives at a location where an unsuspecting victim is surrounded by vampires. He doesn't panic. He doesn't need to ask what is happening. He already knows. And when the situation becomes dangerous, he acts. That tells us almost everything we need to know about him. Blade has done this before. Many times. One of the most effective aspects of the movie is how little it relies on traditional exposition. Instead of stopping the story every few minutes to explain the mythology, the film allows the audience to learn by watching. We discover how the vampires live. We discover how they organize themselves. We learn what Blade can do. We see the relationship between the younger vampires and the older ruling class. The world is explained through behavior rather than lectures. That makes the mythology feel more natural. The movie trusts the audience to keep up. Then we meet Deacon Frost. Frost represents a new generation of vampire. He doesn't respect the ancient hierarchy. He doesn't want to wait centuries for his opportunity. He wants power immediately. That puts him into conflict with the established vampire leadership. The older vampires represent tradition. Frost represents rebellion. And Blade is caught in the middle. The conflict between the two vampire factions eventually becomes connected to Blade's own mission, turning what initially appears to be a series of ordinary vampire hunts into something much larger. Another thing that makes the character work is the clarity of his motivation. Blade isn't searching for his purpose. He already has one. He hunts vampires. He has spent his entire life preparing for that mission, and the movie rarely gives him reason to question it. That consistency makes him different from many modern superhero protagonists. He isn't constantly debating whether he should use his powers. He isn't trying to discover whether he's capable of becoming a hero. He's already there. He's simply doing the job. And he does it efficiently. The movie's filmmaking style reinforces that attitude. The camera frequently moves aggressively around the characters. Extreme angles, rapid movement, and close framing make the action feel immediate. The human world and vampire world also have noticeably different visual identities. Vampire clubs are filled with artificial light, color, and movement. Other parts of their society feel older, darker, and more imposing. That distinction becomes especially interesting when comparing the younger vampires with the established elders. The younger generation surrounds itself with modern nightlife and contemporary culture. The older vampires occupy spaces that feel ancient. It's almost as if the vampire world is divided between the past and the future. The soundtrack is another major part of the film's personality. Rather than relying entirely on a traditional orchestral superhero score, Blade incorporates hip-hop, electronic music, and rock influences. The result is energetic and distinctly tied to the late 1990s. During the action sequences, the music adds another layer of momentum. During quieter moments, the soundtrack creates a more relaxed atmosphere. It gives the movie an identity beyond its visuals. Even years later, the music remains one of the easiest ways to recognize the era in which Blade was made. The film is violent. Extremely violent. But the violence isn't simply there for shock value. The vampires are monsters, and the movie treats them as monsters. Blade's weapons are designed specifically for killing them, and the filmmakers aren't afraid to show the consequences. Bodies explode. Creatures burn. Blood covers the screen. Limbs are destroyed. The action has weight because the filmmakers allow the audience to see what happens when Blade's weapons connect. That physicality separates Blade from many later superhero movies that became increasingly careful about how violence was presented. Here, the brutality is part of the character's world. Blade isn't fighting ordinary criminals. He's fighting supernatural predators. And the movie wants us to feel the difference. What makes Blade surprisingly effective is the combination of simplicity and confidence. The story isn't overloaded with mythology. The hero's motivation is clear. The villain wants power. The action moves quickly. The visual style is distinctive. And the soundtrack gives the entire film a pulse. It doesn't spend its time apologizing for being a comic book movie. It simply embraces the concept and builds its own world around it. That confidence is a major reason Blade remains an important piece of superhero cinema. Before Marvel became synonymous with blockbuster franchises, Blade demonstrated that a comic book character could walk into a theater, break the rules, and still come out a winner. One of the biggest reasons Blade works is Wesley Snipes. From the moment he appears on screen, he doesn't feel like a conventional superhero. Blade isn't interested in fame. He doesn't see himself as a symbol. He's a man with a target, a purpose, and years of experience behind him. Snipes plays him with a controlled intensity. His dialogue is measured, his expression rarely changes, and even when the situation becomes completely chaotic, Blade remains focused. That restraint makes him intimidating. The character doesn't need to announce that he's dangerous. The movie shows us. Several major actors were reportedly considered for Blade, but Snipes proved particularly suited to the role because of his martial arts background. The physical demands of the character were enormous. Blade isn't supposed to look like an ordinary man who happens to know how to fight. He needs to look like someone who has spent his entire life preparing for combat. Snipes brings that credibility to the screen. The fight scenes are built around his physical abilities, and his movements are fast, deliberate, and powerful. Instead of relying entirely on frantic editing to disguise the action, the film frequently allows us to see the performers actually execute the choreography. That gives the fights a satisfying physical quality. Blade doesn't simply defeat his opponents. He overwhelms them. But Snipes isn't working alone. Kris Kristofferson gives the movie another one of its strongest performances as Abraham Whistler. Where Blade is young, focused, and almost emotionally sealed off, Whistler is older, rougher, and far more cynical. Their relationship gives the movie a human center. Whistler isn't just Blade's weapons expert. He's his mentor. He's the person who helped shape Blade into the hunter he became. And his personality provides some much-needed humor in a movie that spends a great deal of time surrounded by death and violence. His dry attitude and miserable disposition make him one of the most memorable characters in the film. Unfortunately, Blade isn't equally strong from beginning to end. The final act is where some of the movie's weaknesses become obvious. The story spends much of its running time building toward an enormous supernatural confrontation. The mythology suggests that something extraordinary is about to happen. But when the final battle finally arrives, it doesn't completely deliver on that promise. Instead of becoming the terrifying climax the setup seems to promise, the confrontation becomes a more conventional action sequence. The pacing also becomes noticeably faster, with certain developments happening almost immediately. Some of the computer-generated effects haven't aged particularly well either. Technology has advanced dramatically since 1998, and several digital effects that may have seemed impressive at the time now look noticeably dated. That doesn't destroy the movie, but it can take you out of the experience. Ironically, the practical effects and physical action often hold up better. The blood, makeup, costumes, and stunt work still have a tangible quality that some of the digital imagery lacks. The villain is another area where opinions can differ. Deacon Frost has an interesting concept. He's a younger vampire challenging an ancient establishment. That's a strong foundation for a villain. The problem is that Frost doesn't always feel physically or psychologically intimidating enough to match Blade. His arrogance is clear, but his menace isn't always convincing. The younger vampires surrounding him also feel heavily connected to the late 1990s aesthetic. Their clothing, dialogue, and attitude sometimes make the movie feel like a time capsule from the era. And while that can be entertaining today, it occasionally weakens the seriousness of the story. Another missed opportunity is the film's relationship with horror. Blade contains vampires, blood, monsters, and supernatural mythology, but it often behaves more like an action movie than a horror film. Considering how dark the premise is, there was enormous potential for genuine horror. The world could have been more frightening. The vampires could have felt more mysterious. And the supernatural elements could have created a stronger atmosphere of dread. The movie instead prioritizes momentum and spectacle. That choice isn't necessarily wrong, but it does mean some of the horror potential remains unexplored. The later films in the franchise would experiment with that side of the mythology in different ways. Despite those weaknesses, Blade remains an important movie. If you enjoy comic book adaptations, martial arts cinema, supernatural action, or late 1990s genre films, it's absolutely worth watching. It arrived at a crucial moment. Comic book movies weren't yet the dominant force they would become. Studios were still uncertain about how seriously audiences would take these characters. Then Blade arrived with guns, martial arts, vampires, blood, and a black action hero at the center of the story. It didn't look like the superhero movies audiences were accustomed to. And that was precisely the point. The film understood that its hero didn't need to behave like Superman or Batman. Blade wasn't interested in inspiring people. He wasn't searching for approval. He wasn't even completely comfortable with his own humanity. He simply knew what needed to be done. That darker approach helped expand the possibilities of comic book cinema. At a time when many adaptations were struggling to find the right tone, Blade demonstrated that a Marvel character could headline an adult-oriented action movie and succeed. Looking back, Blade has imperfections. Some effects have aged. The villain could have been stronger. The final battle doesn't completely live up to the build-up. And the movie sometimes chooses action over horror when the premise could have supported both. But its strengths are much more memorable. Wesley Snipes is magnetic. The action is energetic. The soundtrack gives the film its own personality. The production design creates a distinctive vampire underground. And the movie never seems embarrassed about being strange. Most importantly, Blade helped prove that comic book movies could be darker, more violent, and more experimental. It wasn't merely a successful vampire movie. It became an important stepping stone toward the superhero cinema that would dominate Hollywood in the decades that followed. And when you watch it today, that's perhaps the most interesting thing about it. You're not just watching an old Marvel adaptation. You're watching one of the films that helped make the modern superhero era possible. Blade wastes almost no time introducing its central character. We meet Blade in the middle of a vampire hunt, and the movie immediately establishes what makes him different. He's a hybrid. He possesses many of the physical advantages associated with vampires while avoiding the weaknesses that normally come with being one. That makes him uniquely dangerous. To the vampires, he's an abomination. To humans, he's something they don't fully understand. And to himself, he's simply a hunter. During one of Blade's operations, Karen Jensen becomes caught in the middle of the vampire conflict. What begins as a terrifying encounter quickly becomes an introduction to a hidden world she never knew existed. Blade takes Karen to safety, where she meets Abraham Whistler. Whistler explains the truth. Vampires aren't legends. They're living among humans. They have their own society, their own hierarchy, and their own technology. And for years, Blade and Whistler have been fighting a secret war against them. Their weapons are specifically designed around vampire weaknesses. Everything they use has a purpose. Blade isn't carrying an arsenal because it looks impressive. He's carrying it because every weapon has been engineered to kill something that isn't human. One of the more interesting ideas in the movie is the division within vampire society. The oldest vampires consider themselves the legitimate ruling class. They were born vampires and believe that bloodline gives them authority. Then there are vampires like Deacon Frost. They weren't born into the vampire world. They were transformed. Because of that, the older generation considers them inferior. Frost refuses to accept that judgment. And this creates a political struggle inside the vampire community. The problem is that the film doesn't spend enough time exploring this society. There's an entire civilization operating beneath the human world, complete with social divisions and political power struggles. That's fascinating material. But the movie often moves past it before we can fully appreciate how that society works. A deeper exploration of vampire culture could have made Frost's rebellion much more compelling. Karen's involvement also attracts attention from the vampires. She becomes a target, forcing Blade and Whistler to keep moving while trying to understand exactly what Frost is planning. The hunters eventually discover that Frost has access to powerful allies and resources far beyond those of an ordinary vampire. His ambitions aren't limited to controlling one territory. He's attempting to overturn the existing vampire hierarchy altogether. And Blade is becoming increasingly important to that plan. For all of Blade's advantages, he has one major problem. His condition is changing. The serum he uses to control his vampire instincts is becoming less effective. Every dose buys him time, but the effects don't last forever. That's an excellent idea for the character because it introduces something Blade normally seems to lack. A ticking clock. For most of the movie, Blade appears almost unstoppable. He's stronger than the vampires. He's faster than the humans. He's more experienced than everyone around him. But his body is slowly betraying him. Karen, with her medical expertise, realizes that there may be a way to help. She believes she could potentially develop a treatment that might reverse Blade's condition. The problem is time. Finding a permanent solution could take years. Blade doesn't have years. The conflict becomes personal when Whistler is attacked. Blade has spent years fighting beside him, and their relationship is much deeper than that of a typical mentor and student. Whistler is effectively Blade's family. When Blade believes he has lost him, the emotional impact is immediate. But the story isn't finished with Whistler yet. His survival becomes another complication as the vampire conflict escalates. And Blade now has another reason to stop Frost before everything he has built collapses. The investigation eventually leads Blade toward an even more disturbing revelation. His mother, the woman whose death shaped his entire life, is connected to the vampire world in a way he never expected. What Blade believed about his past begins to unravel. The person responsible for his transformation is tied directly to the enemy he's been hunting. Suddenly, the vampire war isn't just about revenge against strangers. It's connected to Blade's own birth. His identity was created by the same world he has spent his life trying to destroy. Frost's plan eventually leads everyone toward an ancient vampire temple. There, he intends to perform a ritual capable of summoning an immensely powerful supernatural force. His objective is simple: take the power for himself. The ancient vampire leadership believes it can control the situation. Frost believes he can destroy the old order. Blade is caught between them. Karen is trying to find a way to save him. Whistler is fighting to survive. And the vampire world is preparing for a transformation that could permanently alter the balance between humans and vampires. It's easy to forget how unusual this movie was when it came out. Before Blade, Marvel's history on screen was hardly a model of success. There had been television adaptations, strange low-budget experiments and productions that never reached the level the studio wanted. The modern superhero movie formula simply didn't exist yet. Then along came Blade. A relatively obscure Marvel character. A black action star. An R-rated vampire movie. Martial arts. Guns. Blood. And a hero who wasn't remotely interested in behaving like a traditional superhero. On paper, it sounded ridiculous. That's exactly why it was such a risk. The comic book Blade was also considerably different from the cinematic version. The filmmakers took the basic concept and transformed it into something more contemporary. Instead of simply reproducing the old comics, they created a character who fit naturally into the action cinema of the 1990s. That was one of the smartest choices they made. The movie doesn't feel like someone took an old comic and simply filmed it. It feels like the character was rebuilt specifically for the screen. And Wesley Snipes was the perfect performer for that transformation. At its best, Blade works because it creates the suggestion of a much larger universe. There are vampire elders. There are younger vampires. There are human collaborators. There are specialized weapons. There are ancient rituals. There are hidden institutions. And somewhere in the middle of all of it is Blade. The movie doesn't explain every corner of this world. Instead, it gives us enough information to believe that the vampire civilization existed long before Blade discovered it. That's what makes the mythology compelling. You get the feeling that we're seeing only one small part of a much bigger underground society. The original comic book Blade had a very different visual identity. The movie version was modernized into a sleek, intimidating action hero who could move naturally between martial arts, firearms, and supernatural combat. That transformation was essential. Without it, Blade might have remained another forgotten attempt at adapting a Marvel character. Instead, it became the foundation for a franchise and an important early example of what a modern superhero movie could be. The film didn't wait for superhero cinema to become popular. It helped make that popularity possible. The original Blade was already an interesting character. But the version audiences know today owes a tremendous amount to the filmmakers who reinvented him for the screen. Director Stephen Norrington helped give the character a modern visual identity, while screenwriter David S. Goyer reshaped Blade's background and mythology. Wesley Snipes then brought that interpretation to life. Together, they created a version of the character that eventually became more recognizable than many elements of the original comics. One of the biggest changes was Blade's ability to walk freely in daylight. The comic book character wasn't originally defined by the same daywalker concept that became central to the movie. After the film, however, the daywalker became inseparable from Blade's identity. That's a fascinating example of a movie adaptation changing its source material so successfully that the new interpretation eventually becomes the one most people associate with the character. Another reason Blade may have worked so well was that most mainstream audiences didn't know who Blade was. There was no enormous public expectation surrounding the character. People weren't walking into theaters comparing every costume, line of dialogue, and character decision with decades of previous movies. The filmmakers had freedom. They could take a relatively obscure Marvel character and rebuild him for a contemporary audience. And that's exactly what happened. Instead of trying to satisfy an enormous existing fan base, the movie had to accomplish one simple thing: make Blade interesting. Stephen Norrington's filmmaking style is unmistakably aggressive. The movie moves quickly. The camera rarely sits still for long. Lighting constantly shifts between bright artificial colors and deep shadows. The result sometimes feels less like a traditional horror movie and more like a feature-length music video. That won't work for everyone. But I think it gives Blade a personality. The late 1990s techno and electronic soundtrack fits perfectly with the underground vampire clubs. The music doesn't simply play in the background. It drives the action. When Blade starts fighting, the soundtrack often becomes another part of the choreography. And because the film was made during the height of that particular musical era, it has a style that is impossible to separate from its time. Years later, Deadpool would become famous for proving that an R-rated comic book movie could become a massive mainstream success. But it wasn't the first. That distinction belongs to Blade. In 1998, putting a Marvel character into an R-rated action horror movie was still a considerable gamble. The violence could be graphic. The vampires could be genuinely grotesque. And the movie didn't have to soften its world to appeal to children. That gave the filmmakers freedom to create something much darker than the superhero adaptations audiences had become accustomed to. The basic concept was already strong. Blade is a hybrid. He possesses many of the strengths of the undead while retaining his human identity. He can move through daylight. He has extraordinary physical abilities. And he has dedicated his life to hunting the very creatures whose biology is part of his own. That contradiction gives the character depth. Blade isn't simply fighting an external enemy. He's constantly fighting the possibility of becoming one of them. The serum he takes helps control that side of himself, but it also creates another problem. His human side is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. So underneath all the guns and martial arts, there is a much simpler story. A man is fighting monsters while trying not to become one. The movie begins with Blade's origin. His mother is attacked while pregnant, and the encounter has consequences that will define her child's entire life. The story then jumps forward decades. Instead of spending a long time explaining Blade's history, the movie introduces him through one of the most memorable vampire sequences in the film. A nightclub appears to be hosting an ordinary party. Then something strange happens. Blood begins pouring from the sprinkler system. The crowd initially doesn't understand what they're seeing. The vampires do. They're thrilled. The humans are horrified. Within moments, the nightclub becomes a supernatural bloodbath. It's an incredibly efficient way to introduce the world. The audience immediately understands that these creatures aren't romanticized vampires. They're predators. And Blade has come prepared to hunt them. Blade tears through the club with brutal efficiency. Vampires are burned, destroyed, and reduced to ash. The scene establishes his abilities without stopping to explain them. We don't need a narrator telling us that Blade is powerful. We watch him prove it. But one vampire survives. The creature escapes and later attacks Karen Jensen, a hematologist who has no idea that vampires exist. That's when Blade's two worlds collide. Blade arrives at the hospital and stops the vampire before Karen can be killed. He then takes her to his headquarters, where she meets Whistler. Karen is understandably confused. From her perspective, she has just been attacked by a monster and rescued by a man who appears to know exactly what that monster was. Whistler isn't initially convinced that bringing a civilian into their operation is a good idea. As far as he's concerned, Karen has seen too much. She knows vampires are real. She knows Blade exists. And she could become a liability. But Blade believes she may be useful. Karen's medical knowledge could eventually help them understand the infection, and perhaps even find a way to control the condition affecting Blade himself. That introduction also establishes something important about Blade. He doesn't behave like someone who expects to be rescued. He's already accepted what he is. His problem isn't discovering his identity. It's surviving it. That's why the character feels different from many superhero protagonists. Blade doesn't spend the movie asking whether he should become a hero. He became one long ago. The question is whether he'll still be able to remain human while doing the job. And that makes the vampire hunter much more interesting than a simple monster-killing action hero. Looking back, Blade deserves credit for more than launching a franchise. It helped demonstrate that comic book adaptations could have different tones. They didn't all have to look like traditional superhero adventures. A Marvel character could exist inside horror. A superhero could carry an R rating. A black actor could headline a serious comic book action franchise. And an obscure character could become a major cinematic icon. That's the real legacy of Blade. The movie took a character that most people barely knew and gave him such a strong cinematic identity that, decades later, audiences still picture Wesley Snipes whenever they hear the name Blade. The adaptation didn't simply translate the comic. It reinvented it. And in this case, the reinvention became the version people remembered. Blade quickly makes it clear that he didn't kill Karen. Whistler isn't exactly thrilled about having a civilian inside their operation, but Karen's situation soon becomes impossible to ignore. She hasn't developed the obvious symptoms of vampirism. Instead, something unusual is happening to her. Because of her medical background, Karen begins examining her own condition and realizes that the infection may provide information that could help both herself and Blade. She becomes more than a victim. She becomes a potential solution to Blade's greatest problem. Meanwhile, Blade and Karen begin discovering just how organized the vampire world really is. This isn't simply a collection of monsters hiding in random locations. There is a hierarchy. At the top are vampires who were born into the species, the old bloodlines that consider themselves the legitimate aristocracy of the undead. Below them are those who were turned. The strange thing is that this superiority seems to be based largely on tradition and bloodline rather than any obvious physical advantage. The younger vampires may be just as strong, just as dangerous, and sometimes even more ambitious. And one of them has had enough. Deacon Frost has no interest in remaining beneath the ancient vampire leadership. He doesn't accept the idea that birth determines who deserves power. So Frost decides to destroy the existing order. His plan is enormous. He intends to use an ancient ritual to resurrect a powerful blood deity and then take that power for himself. If he succeeds, Frost won't simply become another vampire leader. He could become something far more dangerous. The old vampires understand the threat, but their confidence becomes one of their greatest weaknesses. They have spent centuries believing that their position makes them untouchable. Frost knows better. This is one area where the movie could have gone deeper. The idea of an immortal society divided by bloodline is fascinating. Imagine centuries of vampire politics. Ancient families protecting their status. New vampires demanding equality. Human collaborators working for both sides. Secret rules governing who can rise through the hierarchy. That could have created an entire political thriller inside the vampire story. Instead, the movie mostly uses the concept to establish Frost's motivation. It's an interesting idea that feels larger than the amount of screen time it receives. While Frost prepares his ritual, Karen continues studying the vampire infection. Her research eventually leads to an important breakthrough. She develops a serum capable of reversing vampirism in an infected human. For Karen, this means a possible cure for herself. For Blade, it could mean something even more important. His vampire nature has always been both his greatest advantage and his greatest burden. If Karen can develop a reliable treatment, Blade could potentially eliminate the part of himself that he spent his entire life fighting. But that also raises a difficult question. Would Blade actually want to? His vampire biology gives him the abilities that allow him to hunt other vampires. Without it, would he still be Blade? That's the contradiction at the heart of the character. Blade hates vampires. But his powers come from them. The very thing he wants to destroy inside himself is also the reason he's capable of destroying everyone else. It's almost like fighting a war with the enemy's weapons permanently attached to your body. And the longer he survives, the harder it becomes to separate the human from the vampire. That gives the character an emotional conflict beneath all the action. Anyone expecting something like Deadpool should know immediately that Blade operates in a completely different register. There isn't much comedy. The movie takes itself seriously. Its world is dark, violent, and deliberately exaggerated. The late 1990s aesthetic is everywhere. Industrial locations, leather costumes, colored lighting, heavy shadows, techno music, and action sequences built around the musical rhythm of the era. It can feel extremely 1998. But that's also part of its charm. Blade isn't particularly interested in being philosophically complicated. The story is relatively straightforward. Blade hunts vampires. Frost wants power. Karen wants a cure. Whistler wants to keep Blade alive. The vampire elders want to preserve their control. That's basically the engine driving the movie. But the simplicity allows the filmmakers to focus on style. And stylistically, the movie is extremely confident. The camera frequently takes unusual angles. The sets are exaggerated. The costumes are larger than life. Shadows dominate the frame. The editing moves rapidly between wide compositions and extreme close-ups. Everything is designed to make the world feel heightened. In that sense, Blade understands something important about adapting comics. It doesn't need to imitate the exact appearance of a comic panel. Instead, it translates the feeling of one. The movie constantly presents exaggerated images. A nightclub filled with blood. A vampire exploding into ash. Blade standing in a dark corridor covered in weapons. Strange creatures emerging from shadows. Ancient vampires meeting beneath a modern city. These images aren't realistic. They're graphic novel imagery translated into motion. And that gives the film its unique visual personality. If you're watching Blade expecting an incredibly sophisticated narrative, you may be disappointed. The plot has holes. Some characters could have been developed further. The vampire hierarchy is more interesting in concept than in execution. And Frost doesn't always feel like the terrifying mastermind the story wants him to be. But that doesn't stop the movie from being entertaining. It understands what it wants to deliver. Action. Horror. Style. Blood. Martial arts. And a charismatic hero at the center of it all. At a time when comic book adaptations were often treated as disposable entertainment, Blade approached the material with considerably more confidence. It treated the visual world seriously. It gave the protagonist a distinctive identity. And it proved that a comic book movie could be built around atmosphere and physical action rather than simply dialogue and exposition. The result is less like a conventional superhero film and more like a dark graphic novel that happens to be moving. That's why Blade remains so entertaining. It isn't perfect. It isn't especially subtle. And it certainly isn't trying to be realistic. But it knows exactly what kind of experience it wants to give the audience. A dark city. A hidden vampire civilization. A relentless hunter. And enough blood to fill the entire screen. For a 1998 Marvel adaptation, that's a pretty impressive achievement. Blade's story begins before he is even born. His mother is attacked by a vampire while she is pregnant. The encounter infects her unborn child, leaving Blade with a unique condition. He becomes a human-vampire hybrid who can access many vampire abilities without being completely transformed into one of them. After losing his mother, Blade eventually comes under the protection of Abraham Whistler. Whistler becomes much more than a mentor. He becomes the person who teaches Blade how to survive. Together, they dedicate their lives to hunting the creatures responsible for Blade's existence. By the time the main story begins, Blade is already an experienced hunter. The vampires aren't simply hiding in isolated corners of the city. They have established networks throughout major urban centers. They operate clubs, businesses, and underground organizations while remaining invisible to most humans. Some victims are even deliberately lured into their world. Promises of forbidden experiences turn into traps. Once the victims are captured, they're infected and transformed. This gives the vampire society a disturbing advantage. Every human they convert potentially becomes another soldier. The movie makes a point of showing that Blade doesn't rely entirely on his supernatural abilities. Whistler has spent years developing specialized equipment designed specifically for vampire hunting. Every weapon has a function. Some exploit their sensitivity to sunlight. Others use garlic, silver, or other weaknesses. Blade carries this equipment like a soldier carrying military gear. Nothing is ornamental. Everything is designed for the next hunt. That attention to preparation helps sell the idea that Blade has been doing this for years. Karen's encounter with the vampires becomes one of the film's major turning points. After being attacked, she's brought to Blade and Whistler's underground headquarters. The hunters aren't sure whether she can be saved. Whistler uses their experimental treatment to slow the infection, giving Karen time to survive long enough for them to understand what has happened. That moment changes Karen's role. She begins the story as someone who needs protection. But her medical knowledge eventually becomes essential to Blade's survival. She understands the infection in a way that even the vampire hunters don't. And that knowledge may provide the key to controlling Blade's condition. Blade's greatest advantage is also becoming his greatest threat. The serum he takes every day suppresses his vampire instincts and helps maintain his humanity. But his body is beginning to resist it. Each treatment becomes less effective. That means Blade isn't invincible. He's running out of time. This is one of the smartest ideas in the movie because it creates vulnerability without taking away his power. Blade can still destroy vampires. He can still survive injuries that would kill ordinary people. But his own biology is slowly catching up with him. At the center of the vampire uprising is Deacon Frost. Frost represents the younger generation that refuses to accept the authority of the ancient bloodlines. But his ambition goes beyond simply becoming the leader of the younger vampires. He wants something supernatural. Something ancient. Something powerful enough to overturn the existing order. Frost believes an ancient vampire deity can give him the power he needs. The ritual becomes the ultimate expression of his rebellion. He's not asking for permission anymore. He's attempting to take the throne by force. Eventually, the story moves away from the modern city and toward an ancient vampire temple. The location feels completely different from the modern clubs and laboratories we've seen earlier. It's old. Dark. Almost ritualistic. That contrast is important because the movie is bringing two versions of the vampire world together. The modern underground civilization. And the ancient mythology beneath it. Blade has to enter that world to stop Frost before the ritual is completed. Stephen Norrington's direction gives Blade an exaggerated visual quality. The movie doesn't always obey the visual rules of ordinary action cinema. Characters make enormous leaps. Camera angles become extreme. Movement is sometimes exaggerated beyond realistic physical limits. Certain shots almost feel like they're taken directly from an animated graphic novel. That's part of the film's appeal. It's not attempting to make the supernatural look completely ordinary. Instead, it allows the world to bend around the characters. The result can occasionally look dated, but it also gives the movie a dreamlike quality. Wesley Snipes understands something essential about the character. Blade is powerful. But he isn't invulnerable. And that's important. The most compelling superheroes aren't interesting simply because they can defeat everyone. They're interesting because their abilities come with a cost. Blade's cost is his identity. He has spent his entire life fighting vampires while carrying their blood inside him. The very thing that makes him effective is the same thing threatening to consume him. That creates a sadness beneath the character's aggression. Blade rarely shows it directly. But it's there. Without that emotional layer, Blade could have been little more than a collection of impressive action scenes. The weapons are cool. The fights are energetic. The visual effects are ambitious. The soundtrack is memorable. But Blade himself gives all of that a purpose. He's not fighting because he enjoys violence. He's fighting because he doesn't know how to live any other way. Whistler gave him a mission. The vampires gave him an enemy. And his own blood gave him the ability to fight them. That combination created a hero who feels strangely isolated even when surrounded by allies. When Blade appeared in 1998, it stood apart from most comic book adaptations. It wasn't trying to imitate the conventional superhero formula. It mixed horror, science fiction, martial arts, and graphic novel imagery into something much darker. The result helped demonstrate that superhero cinema could have an entirely different visual language. The movie wasn't afraid of shadows. It wasn't afraid of violence. And it wasn't afraid to make its hero uncomfortable. That confidence helped distinguish it from the more conventional comic book adaptations of its era. Even after watching the movie, some aspects of Frost's mythology remain deliberately mysterious. We don't get a complete history of every ancient vampire ritual. We aren't given a detailed explanation of every supernatural rule. Instead, the film provides enough information to understand what Frost wants. He wants power. He wants to destroy the old order. And he wants to become something greater than a normal vampire. The mystery actually works in the movie's favor. It makes the vampire world feel older and larger than the story we're watching. That's ultimately the best way to describe Blade. It feels less like a conventional superhero movie and more like a dark graphic novel brought into motion. The strange costumes. The enormous sets. The exaggerated shadows. The unusual camera movements. The impossible action. The blood. Everything is pushed slightly beyond reality. And Wesley Snipes holds the center of it all. He gives Blade enough humanity that the spectacle never completely overwhelms the character. That's why the movie still works more than 2 decades later. It isn't flawless. But it has an identity. And in a genre where many films can feel interchangeable, having a strong identity is sometimes the most valuable thing a movie can possess. Before we go any further, it's worth understanding what Blade actually is. His name has become synonymous with vampire hunting, but his biology is what makes him so valuable to the creatures he fights. Blade was born after his pregnant mother was attacked by a vampire. That accident left him caught between 2 worlds. He inherited the physical advantages of a vampire, strength, speed, reflexes, and heightened senses, without suffering from some of their most important weaknesses. Most importantly, Blade can walk in daylight. To the vampires, that makes him an anomaly. But it also makes his blood extremely valuable. They don't simply want Blade dead. Some of them want to understand what makes him different. If they could reproduce his advantages while eliminating their weaknesses, they could potentially create a completely new kind of vampire. That's what makes Blade more than an enemy. To the vampire world, he's a biological breakthrough waiting to be exploited. Before the movie fully introduces Blade, it gives us a glimpse of the world he's fighting. A man is lured into an apparently ordinary situation by someone he believes he can trust. But the deeper he follows his guide, the more obvious it becomes that something is wrong. Eventually, he's brought into an industrial location that hides something far more sinister. The scene deliberately plays with the idea of temptation. The victim thinks he's entering a secret party. He doesn't realize he's walking into a feeding ground. And that's an important introduction to the vampires. They don't always need to chase humans. Sometimes humans walk directly toward them. The victim eventually arrives at a nightclub packed with people. At first, it looks like an ordinary underground party. Then the sprinkler system activates. But instead of water, blood begins raining from the ceiling. The human guests are horrified. The vampires are ecstatic. Suddenly, the entire club becomes a feeding frenzy. The sequence is one of the movie's signature moments because it establishes several things simultaneously. The vampires have money. They have infrastructure. They have access to enormous spaces. And they have no fear of revealing their true nature when they're among their own kind. The club also introduces us to Deacon Frost. Unlike the ancient vampires who prefer to operate from secluded locations, Frost embraces modern culture. He doesn't hide from the nightlife. He owns it. His vampires surround themselves with music, technology, fashion, and crowds. That makes Frost's version of vampire society feel distinctly different from the ancient hierarchy. The old vampires look backward. Frost looks forward. He's trying to build a new vampire civilization based on his own rules. And that ambition is precisely what makes him dangerous. Then the atmosphere changes. Blade enters the club. He isn't there to negotiate. He isn't there to investigate. He's there to hunt. The fight that follows is essentially an introduction to Blade's entire combat philosophy. He combines swordsmanship, firearms, and supernatural abilities into one relentless attack. The vampires are prepared for humans. They're not prepared for someone who possesses their own physical advantages. Blade moves through the room with brutal efficiency. One vampire after another is destroyed. And when the police eventually arrive, Blade is already gone. The authorities see a massacre. Blade sees another night's work. The aftermath leads Blade toward one of the most important people in the story. Dr. Karen Jensen. Karen is a hematologist, meaning her understanding of blood makes her uniquely valuable once the vampire infection becomes involved. She has no idea that the supernatural world exists. That changes when a surviving vampire attacks her. Blade arrives at the hospital to finish the creature. But instead of simply walking away, he discovers Karen. She's alive. She's terrified. And she's already been exposed to the vampire infection. Blade could have left Karen behind. Instead, he decides to bring her with him. Part of the reason is practical. Her medical knowledge could help him understand the infection. But there's another reason. Karen reminds Blade of his mother. The connection is established through memories of Blade's birth and the woman who died because of the vampire attack that created him. Karen's presence forces Blade to confront something he normally keeps buried. His mission may be about killing vampires. But his hatred began with something deeply personal. His mother. His childhood. And the life that was taken from him before he ever had the chance to understand it. For Karen, this is the moment her entire understanding of reality collapses. Vampires aren't mythology. The blood-soaked nightclub wasn't an isolated nightmare. And Blade isn't some ordinary man carrying weapons. He's a hybrid who has spent his entire life fighting an underground civilization that most people don't even know exists. But Karen's arrival also changes Blade's world. For the first time, he has someone who can potentially understand the science behind his condition. And that could eventually give him something he has never had before. A chance to choose what he wants to be. The vampire attack also reveals that Frost's plans are already moving forward. He isn't satisfied with controlling a nightclub or challenging a few ancient vampires. He's building towards something much larger. Blade's blood may be one of the missing pieces. Karen's medical knowledge may be another. And the ancient vampire mythology provides the final component. The hunters and the vampires are therefore racing toward the same destination from completely opposite directions. Frost wants to use Blade's unique biology to transcend the limitations of his species. Blade wants to destroy the vampire world before it can evolve into something even worse. Karen is caught between them. And Whistler is trying to keep Blade alive long enough to finish the fight. That's what makes Blade's character more interesting than simply being a powerful vampire hunter. He is simultaneously the vampire's greatest enemy and their greatest opportunity. His blood represents everything they want. Strength without weakness. Immortality without vulnerability. The ability to exist in daylight. Blade spends his life trying to destroy vampires, while the vampires dream about becoming more like him. That's the irony at the heart of the character. The thing that makes Blade special is also the thing that prevents him from ever completely escaping the world he hates. And Karen may be the first person capable of understanding that contradiction. From this point forward, the hunt isn't just about killing vampires. It's about discovering what Blade really is, and deciding whether that part of him can ever be separated from the man he has become. Back at Blade's headquarters, Karen is finally introduced to the man behind the operation, Abraham Whistler. She has barely had time to process what happened before she's given the basic truth. Vampires exist. They're organized. They have been operating alongside humanity for generations. And Blade and Whistler have been fighting them in secret. But Karen has a much more immediate problem. She's been bitten. The treatment Whistler gives her may slow the infection, but it isn't guaranteed to stop it permanently. There are only two possibilities. Karen could survive the infection and experience a period of intense illness. Or she could eventually develop the hunger associated with vampirism. Karen refuses to accept that her future has already been decided. While Karen struggles with her condition, Deacon Frost is making his move. The ancient vampire elders have controlled their society for centuries. They believe their bloodline gives them the right to rule. Frost sees that entire system as an obstacle. He wasn't born into their world. He was turned into a vampire. To the elders, that makes him inferior. To Frost, it simply gives him another reason to hate them. His resentment, ambition, and enormous ego combine into one dangerous plan. He intends to destroy the old hierarchy and create a new order with himself at the center. Frost's advantage isn't just his ambition. It's his willingness to use modern technology. The vampire elders possess ancient documents written in languages they barely understand. Frost takes a completely different approach. He uses contemporary computer technology to analyze the symbols and uncover information hidden inside the ancient texts. That discovery leads him to the mythology of La Magra, an ancient blood deity whose return could give Frost unimaginable power. The ritual isn't simply about becoming a stronger vampire. It's about changing the balance of power between vampires and humans. If Frost succeeds, the vampires would no longer need to hide. They could openly claim the world. But Frost needs one essential ingredient. Pure-blood vampire elders. The old council would never willingly participate in his plan, so Frost decides to remove them by force. He begins hunting them one by one. The ancient rulers who once seemed untouchable suddenly find themselves powerless against the younger vampire they've spent years dismissing. It's a reversal of the hierarchy. The elders believed their age made them invincible. Frost proves that age doesn't matter when someone is willing to destroy the rules. Frost eventually captures one of the elders and takes him outside. The vampire has spent centuries avoiding sunlight. Now Frost forces him directly into it. Frost and his followers protect themselves while the elder is exposed. It's a brutal demonstration of what Frost is willing to do. He's not merely challenging the old leadership. He's humiliating it. And after this point, the vampire elders understand that Frost can no longer be contained. There's only one major component Frost still needs: Blade. Frost discovers that Blade's unique blood may be essential to completing the ritual. That changes everything. Blade is no longer simply Frost's greatest enemy. He's the missing piece. The vampire world wants Blade dead. Frost wants him alive long enough to use him. That distinction puts Blade in an extremely dangerous position. Meanwhile, Karen refuses to accept the idea that she will eventually become a vampire. She begins studying the infection herself. Her medical background gives her an advantage that Blade and Whistler don't possess. She believes the transformation isn't necessarily irreversible. If she can understand what's happening to her blood, she might be able to stop it. And that research could eventually become the key to saving Blade as well. Karen and Blade uncover more information about Frost's plans through ancient vampire texts. These documents function almost like a religious history for the vampire world. They contain references to ancient rituals, bloodlines, and the return of La Magra. The more Blade learns, the more obvious the situation becomes. His blood isn't incidental. It's necessary. Frost can't complete his plan without him. That means Blade has become the central target of the entire vampire uprising. Logically, the answer seems simple. If the vampires need Blade, let them come for him. Use their desperation against them. But the vampire hunters quickly discover that Frost's organization is far more capable than expected. They know how to locate Blade. They know how he operates. And they're getting closer. Every advantage Blade has is slowly being turned against him. Karen is facing her own deadline. The longer the infection remains inside her, the greater the chance that the transformation will become permanent. She refuses to surrender to it. Instead, she throws herself into the research. The conditions aren't exactly ideal. This isn't a modern research facility filled with specialized equipment and a team of scientists. It's a hidden vampire hunting headquarters. The laboratory is improvised. The resources are limited. And Karen is trying to solve a biological problem while being hunted by supernatural creatures. But she keeps working. Because if she succeeds, she could save herself. And possibly Blade. At this point, the story becomes a race on two fronts. Blade is fighting the vampires physically. Karen is fighting them scientifically. Frost is fighting the old vampire hierarchy politically. And all three conflicts are heading toward the same destination. The ritual. If Frost completes it, the vampire world changes forever. If Karen can't stop the infection, she could become one of the creatures she's trying to destroy. And if Blade falls into Frost's hands, his blood could provide the final ingredient needed to unleash La Magra. The hunter has become the hunted. And for the first time in his life, Blade isn't completely certain that he controls the outcome. 1. Karen returns to her laboratory and finally has access to the equipment she needs. Now she can stop treating the infection as a mystery and start treating it like a scientific problem. Her first priority is herself. She needs to understand what the vampire infection is doing to her body and determine whether the transformation can be reversed. But Blade gives her another challenge. His daily serum is becoming less effective. For years, it has allowed him to control his vampire instincts without depending on human blood. But his body is adapting to it. Eventually, the serum may stop working altogether. Karen believes she can develop something better. If she succeeds, she could save herself and give Blade a permanent solution to his condition. While experimenting with vampire blood, Karen makes an unexpected discovery. The substance reacts violently when exposed to certain compounds. Instead of simply burning, the infected blood can become explosively unstable. That accident gives the hunters something they desperately need: a new weapon. Karen and Whistler turn the discovery into specialized ammunition for Blade. Now his arsenal becomes even more dangerous. He doesn't just shoot vampires anymore. He can make them explode from the inside out. The weapon is crude compared with modern technology, but against an enemy that normally takes enormous punishment, it gives Blade a major advantage. The movie also reminds us why Blade is so unusual. He can walk beneath the sun. For ordinary vampires, daylight is lethal. Their bodies burn almost instantly when exposed to it. Blade doesn't have that weakness. He's able to move through the daytime world without hiding in shadows. That ability makes him something the vampire community both fears and envies. And Frost understands exactly how valuable that difference could become. Eventually, Blade encounters Frost again. Their confrontation quickly turns into another reminder that Frost doesn't fight by ordinary rules. He uses innocent people as leverage, forcing Blade to choose between pursuing him and protecting a civilian. Blade chooses the civilian. That's important. For all his brutality, Blade still has a moral boundary. Frost doesn't. And that's one of the fundamental differences between them. Blade kills monsters because he believes it's necessary. Frost is willing to sacrifice anyone if it gets him closer to power. But Frost has already learned where Blade and Whistler are operating. The Hunter's headquarters is no longer safe. The vampire organization begins closing in. Frost knows that Blade's blood is essential to the ritual. He also knows that Blade won't willingly cooperate. So Frost decides to attack the Hunters directly. Whistler becomes one of the main targets. Blade is forced into a trap, and the vampires finally manage to overwhelm him. The situation becomes even worse when Blade loses access to his medication. Without the serum, his vampire instincts begin taking over. His hunger becomes stronger. His body becomes increasingly difficult to control. The very powers that make him such an effective hunter are now turning against him. It's the nightmare he's been trying to prevent his entire life. And Frost knows it. Frost's plan is now almost complete. The vampire elders have been eliminated or captured. The ritual location has been prepared. The ancient symbols have been decoded. And Blade has been brought into Frost's possession. But there's another requirement. The ritual needs 12 pure-blood vampires. Frost has already taken control of the vampire hierarchy specifically because he needs them. The ancient bloodline that once gave the elders their authority is now being used as fuel for Frost's transformation. Their power will become part of his ritual. The final ceremony takes place inside an ancient temple built specifically for the worship of La Magra. Everything about the location feels different from the modern vampire clubs. The neon lights are gone. The contemporary music disappears. What remains is ancient architecture, enormous chambers, and mysterious symbols covering the walls. The temple feels like a physical connection between the vampire civilization of the present and the mythology buried beneath it. 12 pure-blood vampires are positioned around the ritual chamber. Frost stands at the center. And Blade is brought to the place where his blood can finally be used. Frost isn't interested in ruling the vampires as they currently exist. He wants to evolve beyond them. He believes the old vampire aristocracy has wasted centuries hiding from humanity. His solution is simple. Destroy the old system. Summon La Magra. Take the power for himself. Then allow the vampires to stop hiding and become the dominant species on Earth. It's an enormous ambition for someone who began as an outsider. And ironically, Frost's obsession with overcoming his inferior status is what drives him to become more dangerous than the elders ever imagined. By this point, Blade has almost nothing left. His serum is gone. His allies have been attacked. The vampires have captured him. And his own body is beginning to turn against him. But Blade has one advantage Frost consistently underestimates. He refuses to stay defeated. Everything he's learned from Whistler, every weapon Karen developed, and every battle he survived has prepared him for this moment. The final confrontation isn't simply Blade versus Frost. It's Blade versus the entire vampire system that created him. When Blade arrived in 1998, few people could have predicted what it would become. Wesley Snipes transformed the character into a credible action hero while maintaining the darker elements of the comic book mythology. The movie combined martial arts, horror, science fiction, and superhero storytelling without trying to make them feel identical. Its success eventually produced sequels and a television adaptation. More importantly, it helped demonstrate that Marvel characters could carry serious, visually distinctive movies. The franchise began with an obscure vampire hunter. It ended up helping change the expectations surrounding comic book cinema. And that is perhaps the most surprising thing about Blade. The character wasn't one of Marvel's biggest names. There was no massive audience demanding a movie. There was no established cinematic formula waiting for him. Instead, the filmmakers took a relatively unknown hero, gave him a unique visual world, and built the entire movie around Wesley Snipes' screen presence. The result was a film that didn't merely introduce Blade to mainstream audiences. It created the Blade most audiences still recognize today. Blade is unlike the vampires he hunts. He is a hybrid, born from a human mother who was attacked before his birth. The result is a man who possesses many of the physical advantages associated with vampires without being bound by their most obvious weakness. Sunlight doesn't destroy him. Garlic doesn't affect him in the same way. And unlike the creatures he pursues, Blade has retained his humanity. That combination makes him an extraordinary hunter. He's faster, stronger, and more capable than an ordinary human, but he still has a reason to hate the creatures he's hunting. His entire life has been shaped by the war between humans and vampires. And if Blade has one defining characteristic, it's efficiency. He doesn't hunt vampires for glory. He hunts them because he believes someone has to. The movie introduces this world brilliantly. We aren't given a lengthy explanation of vampire society. Instead, we're thrown directly into it. A seemingly ordinary man is persuaded to follow someone into an underground nightclub. The location looks like a typical late-night party. Music is pounding. The room is packed. People are dancing. Nothing immediately appears supernatural. Then the sprinklers activate. Except what falls from the ceiling isn't water. It's blood. The humans panic. The vampires celebrate. And suddenly the entire nightclub transforms into a feeding ground. It's an unforgettable opening because it tells us everything we need to know without stopping the movie for an explanation. These vampires aren't hiding because they're powerless. They're hiding because they haven't decided that they need to reveal themselves yet. Then Blade arrives. The atmosphere changes immediately. He isn't impressed by the party. He isn't frightened by the vampires. He walks into their territory as though he owns it. The fight that follows establishes exactly what kind of hero we're watching. Blade combines martial arts, firearms, and specialized weapons into a single fighting style. He moves with the confidence of someone who has spent decades preparing for these encounters. The vampires may have supernatural abilities. Blade has experience. And experience is enough to make him terrifying. But the nightclub is only one part of a much larger vampire civilization. Behind the scenes, an ancient leadership maintains control over the species. These older vampires have existed for generations and have developed their own rules, traditions, and hierarchy. Their philosophy is relatively simple. Remain hidden. Maintain control. Don't attract unnecessary attention from humanity. Frost considers that philosophy cowardly. He doesn't want peaceful coexistence. He wants domination. Deacon Frost is a different kind of vampire. He's younger, more aggressive, more interested in technology and modern culture. And he's deeply resentful of the ancient vampires who refuse to treat him as their equal. Frost believes the old hierarchy has become obsolete. Instead of continuing to hide from humanity, he wants the vampires to take their rightful place above it. But he needs something powerful enough to make that possible. That brings him to an ancient legend. La Magra. According to the vampire mythology, La Magra represents an almost unimaginable source of power. Frost believes that resurrecting this ancient entity will allow him to transcend the limitations of ordinary vampirism. For centuries, the knowledge surrounding the ritual has remained buried in ancient texts. The old vampires possess fragments of that knowledge. But Frost has something they don't. Modern technology. He uses computers to analyze ancient symbols and decipher information that generations of vampires have been unable or unwilling to understand. The combination of ancient mythology and modern technology becomes one of the movie's most interesting ideas. Frost isn't choosing between the old world and the new. He's combining them. Eventually, Frost's research points toward the Temple of Eternal Night. This isn't simply a location for the final fight. It's the physical representation of everything Frost has been working toward. Ancient symbols. Hidden chambers. Ritualistic architecture. And a connection to a vampire mythology that predates the modern world. The modern nightclub and the ancient temple are almost opposites. One represents the future Frost wants. The other represents the ancient power he's trying to control. Blade is eventually forced into the middle of that conflict. Stephen Norrington gives the movie a very specific visual identity. The camera frequently moves into unusual perspectives. Extreme close-ups emphasize weapons and faces. Quick edits keep the fights moving. Bright colors collide with deep shadows. The film often looks exaggerated rather than realistic. That's appropriate for a comic book adaptation. The vampires aren't presented as ordinary criminals. They're creatures from another world hiding inside ours. And Blade himself often appears almost superhuman. The movie wants the audience to feel that difference. What's remarkable about Blade is how important it became despite the character's relatively low profile before the film. Wesley Snipes essentially defined the cinematic version of Blade. His physicality gave the character credibility as an action hero, while his controlled performance prevented Blade from becoming nothing more than a collection of fight scenes. That interpretation became so influential that later versions of the character had an enormous standard to live up to. Years after the original film, Marvel began developing a new cinematic version of Blade, with Mahershala Ali attached to play the character. That announcement demonstrated just how durable the character had become. Blade had gone from a relatively obscure Marvel vampire hunter to a character important enough to receive another major theatrical adaptation. That's perhaps the strangest part of Blade's history. The character wasn't originally one of Marvel's household names. The movie changed that. It gave him a completely recognizable identity. The black leather. The sword. The sunglasses. The weapons. The martial arts. And above all, the attitude. Blade doesn't need to explain himself. He doesn't need to convince anyone that vampires exist. He already knows. He's been fighting them for most of his life. And that's what makes the character work. He's not a superhero discovering his powers. He's a professional hunter who has already chosen his war. The character's influence has also reached beyond the original trilogy. Modern Marvel projects have gradually established that supernatural and vampire-related elements can exist within the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe. That makes Blade's eventual return especially interesting. The original movie created its own dark corner of the Marvel Universe. A newer adaptation has the opportunity to connect that mythology with a much larger world. But no matter how that version develops, the 1998 film remains the foundation. Before Blade became part of modern superhero discussions, Wesley Snipes had already taken the character into theaters and proved that an unconventional Marvel hero could carry an action horror movie. And that is ultimately why Blade still deserves to be remembered. It didn't wait for the superhero genre to become fashionable. It arrived before the modern superhero boom and helped show the industry what was possible. Blade occupies an unusual position in the Marvel Universe because his abilities place him somewhere between humanity and vampirism. He possesses the strength, speed, and reflexes associated with the undead, yet he can function in daylight and retain control over himself. That makes him particularly dangerous to vampires, but it also explains why his blood is so valuable to them. Blade isn't simply another supernatural fighter. He's essentially proof that the advantages of vampirism might exist without all of its traditional limitations. That difference has always been central to the character. Blade's greatest weapon isn't just his sword or his arsenal, it's the fact that he understands vampires from the inside. He knows how they behave, understands their weaknesses, and has spent years turning that knowledge into a methodical form of combat. He's essentially a supernatural soldier operating in a hidden war that ordinary humans don't even know exists. That raises an important question whenever the character is brought back to the screen: how much of Blade's horror identity should remain intact? The original 1998 movie never tried to disguise what kind of story it was. It was violent, bloody, and unapologetically dark. The vampires weren't merely elegant supernatural characters. They were predators, and the film treated their feeding habits as something genuinely disturbing. That atmosphere helped separate Blade from the more conventional comic book movies of its time. A modern adaptation would have to make an interesting choice. It could follow the broader Marvel formula and keep the character within a PG-13 framework, making him easier to connect with the rest of the cinematic universe. Or it could preserve the harsher horror elements that made the original so distinctive. There are arguments for both approaches. A PG-13 rating would make Blade easier to place alongside other Marvel heroes. It would potentially give the studio access to a much larger audience and make crossovers more straightforward. It could also force filmmakers to rely more heavily on atmosphere, suspense, choreography, and character development instead of simply increasing the amount of blood and violence. But there's an obvious danger. If the movie becomes too sanitized, Blade could lose the very quality that separates him from other Marvel heroes. A vampire hunter should inhabit a darker world. His enemies are undead predators who feed on human beings. His own body is partly connected to that world. His mentor has spent decades fighting creatures that most people believe are imaginary. The story naturally lends itself to horror. That doesn't mean a Blade movie needs to become a non-stop gore festival. Excessive violence isn't automatically frightening, and blood alone doesn't create suspense. The strongest version of Blade would use horror with purpose. A quiet scene in an abandoned building could be more disturbing than an entire room covered in blood if the audience knows something is waiting in the darkness. That's where the character could evolve. The original film had the freedom to exist entirely on its own. It didn't need to explain how vampires connected to dozens of other Marvel characters. A modern version would exist inside a much larger universe, which creates both opportunities and limitations. The challenge would be making Blade feel like Blade without making him feel disconnected from everything around him. The character also doesn't need an enormous superhero budget to work. Blade's story is naturally suited to contained locations, underground clubs, abandoned buildings, laboratories, warehouses, secret vampire communities, and ancient temples. A filmmaker could create a visually ambitious movie without requiring the enormous scale normally associated with cosmic Marvel adventures. That could actually become one of the character's greatest strengths. Instead of trying to make Blade another world-ending superhero spectacle, the filmmakers could bring the story back down to street level. Make the vampire society feel hidden. Make the characters vulnerable. Let the horror breathe. The original Blade succeeded partly because it had its own identity. It didn't look like every other superhero movie. It didn't behave like every other superhero movie. And it didn't apologize for being strange. Any new interpretation has the difficult task of respecting that legacy while still creating something fresh. The goal shouldn't be to recreate the 1998 movie. It should be to understand why the 1998 movie worked, and then find a new way to make audiences believe that the world of Blade is dangerous again. The question of how a modern Blade should be rated has always been a complicated one. The original Wesley Snipes trilogy established the character as a much darker Marvel hero, combining supernatural horror with intense action, graphic violence, and an attitude that would have felt out of place in a traditional family-friendly superhero movie. That darker identity wasn't simply an aesthetic choice. It was part of what made Blade different from the other heroes appearing on screen at the time. A new adaptation therefore faces a difficult balance. Keeping the movie within a PG-13 framework would make it easier to connect Blade with the wider Marvel universe and potentially allow the character to appear alongside other heroes without requiring a completely separate tone. But going too far in that direction could make the vampire hunter feel strangely out of place in his own story. Blade lives in a world where blood, death, and supernatural predators are fundamental parts of the mythology. That doesn't necessarily mean a new movie needs constant graphic violence. Horror can be effective without showing every injury in detail. Atmosphere, suspense, unsettling imagery, and strong character writing can create tension without turning every fight into a gore sequence. In fact, limitations can sometimes force filmmakers to become more creative. A carefully constructed fight can be more memorable because of its choreography and tension rather than the amount of blood on screen. The bigger issue is whether the movie should feel dangerous. Blade shouldn't come across as simply another superhero wearing darker clothes. He's a hunter operating in an underground world populated by creatures that feed on humans. His enemies should feel threatening, and the audience should believe that entering their world carries consequences. The success of darker comic book films has already demonstrated that audiences can embrace mature interpretations when the tone serves the story. But the opposite is also true. Violence for its own sake can quickly become distracting. A Blade movie shouldn't depend on shock value to prove that it's mature. The darkness should come from the character, the mythology, and the atmosphere. Blade's connection to horror also gives Marvel an opportunity to explore a corner of its universe that feels different from conventional superhero adventures. His stories naturally lend themselves to hidden societies, supernatural mythology, nightclubs, abandoned buildings, laboratories, and ancient rituals rather than enormous battles between armies in the sky. That smaller scale could actually be an advantage. A Blade movie doesn't need to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to feel impressive. A well-designed supernatural thriller could achieve much of its impact through practical sets, atmospheric lighting, stunt choreography, and carefully constructed action. Keeping the scale under control could also allow more attention to be given to Blade himself. There is another important consideration. Blade eventually has to exist within the larger Marvel universe. The original Snipes movies were independent stories, so they didn't have to worry about how vampires, superheroes, and other supernatural characters fit together. A modern version has a different responsibility. It has to establish Blade's mythology while leaving enough room for him to interact with the wider Marvel world. That doesn't mean the movie should lose its individuality. In fact, the best approach would probably be to let Blade occupy his own darker corner of the universe. He can acknowledge that other heroes exist without turning his entire story into a crossover. His world should still feel dangerous, mysterious, and distinctly different. Marvel has already demonstrated that it can experiment with supernatural material. A darker Blade story therefore wouldn't necessarily feel incompatible with the larger franchise. The challenge is making the darkness meaningful rather than simply making the movie more violent. Ultimately, the rating itself isn't what determines whether Blade works. What matters is whether the filmmakers understand the character. Blade is a vampire hunter who happens to possess many of the abilities of the creatures he kills. He's an outsider who can never completely belong to either side. He's powerful, but his powers come with a personal cost. He's surrounded by monsters, yet constantly has to fight the monster inside himself. That's where the horror should come from. The debate over Blade's rating becomes even more interesting when we consider how Marvel has gradually become more comfortable with darker storytelling. The MCU has already explored subjects such as political manipulation, grief, psychological trauma, identity, and supernatural horror. Projects centered on characters like Captain America, Wanda, Moon Knight, and Doctor Strange have shown that Marvel doesn't necessarily need to keep every story lighthearted. That creates room for Blade to occupy a more mature corner of the universe without completely separating him from the rest of the franchise. The key, however, is that maturity shouldn't simply mean more blood. Wesley Snipes has previously argued that a Blade story doesn't automatically require an R rating simply because the character deals with vampires and violence. That is an important distinction. A mature film should be mature because of its themes, characters, and storytelling, not because the filmmakers are trying to fill every action sequence with graphic imagery. For that reason, a hard PG-13 could potentially be an effective compromise. It would allow Blade to retain an intimidating atmosphere while keeping the character accessible enough to interact with the wider Marvel universe. The filmmakers could emphasize choreography, suspense, practical effects, disturbing vampire mythology, and psychological tension rather than relying entirely on explicit gore. At the same time, Marvel shouldn't weaken Blade simply to make him fit a predetermined rating. If a particular scene genuinely requires stronger violence to communicate the danger of the vampire world, the filmmakers shouldn't remove it merely because they're afraid of crossing a line. The story should determine the tone, not the other way around. The biggest mistake would be treating the rating as a marketing strategy. Making Blade excessively violent just so Marvel can advertise its first major R-rated superhero movie would be just as misguided as stripping away the character's darker elements to preserve a safer rating. Neither approach respects what actually makes Blade interesting. The character's core should come first.